This is a video about the Fellowship of the Ring's prefaces. I'm going through the whole of the Lord of the Rings, and my plan is to comment on every chapter. I'll find something to say about each one. And I'm beginning with the prefaces. There are a lot of people out there who know the Lord of the Rings better than me. I've read the books lots of times, but I'm just a reader. I'm just someone who enjoyed them. And I'm going to comment on the books as I go through as if it's my first time reading. I probably can't completely achieve that. But the plan is to not spoil in any way, so that if somebody who has only read chapter 1 and intends to go on and read the others watches my videos of, for instance, chapter 1, there shouldn't be anything in there that's going to spoil the story for them. The other thing I'm going to do is compare with the movies. And I love the movies. I love the books, and I love the movies as well. I particularly liked the first movie, but then I liked the first book best as well, so maybe that works out. I'm not really sure what I'm going to say apart from that. I'm just going to comment on the things that are of interest to me. So that's sort of going to be the comparison of the books to the movies and what I think were strengths or missed opportunities, and the women in the chapters, which I tend to gravitate towards when I read, and maybe other minority characters if I spot them. And there probably isn't much to say about these early bits, so I'll get started. The Fellowship of the Ring opens with the verse. And just in case anyone doesn't know, there's this verse about rings, which I probably shouldn't read out here, but it begins, 3 rings for the elven kings under the sky. And it goes on to talk about more rings than that. There are the 3 rings, there's the 7 rings, there's the 9 rings, and there's the 1 ring, which makes 20 rings in total. I don't know if that's relevant in any way. It just happens to be, if you add up the rings that are mentioned in this verse at the start of the book, that's what you get. When you've completely finished the series or read the movies and come back to this, you can see sort of how much is in this verse. But when you're brand new to it, like the first time I read it, for instance, that was before the movies were made, you don't know what's relevant and what's not. It's just a pretty verse, and it really is a very pretty verse. It's kind of a nice one. But I don't think I can say any more about that. So that's it, the verse. Moving on, I think I'll skip the contents. Nothing to say about the contents. Moving on to note on the text. And I will read this first sentence. The Lord of the Rings is often erroneously called a trilogy when it is in fact a single novel, consisting of 6 books plus appendices, sometimes published in 3 volumes. That's how I read it. It was 3 volumes. In fact, that's how most of us know it. But the book is not exactly a trilogy. It is a single story. And when you get to the end of the Fellowship of the Ring, it just does an abrupt break and picks up in the 2 Towers. And again, at the end of the 2 Towers, there's an abrupt stop and it picks up in the Return of the King. So if you stop reading before you get right to the end of that 3rd one, you won't really, nothing's been tied up. The movies, of course, are quite different. The movies are very distinct stories in themselves. I mean, they're still following this, but they tidied them up nicely for the movies. And I will say that here that I understand that a movie is a very different type of beast to a book. They have quite a different story anatomy, so logically they're not going to be the same. So sometimes when I say things like the book was done differently or the movie was done differently, that's not actually a criticism of either. There, I do have some criticisms, but that's not one of them. So, note on the text tells us about it's all the meta stuff, the metadata. It tells us the publishing, the first volume, The Fellowship of the Ring, published in Great Britain in 1954, in America later the same year. The Two Towers was published in Britain the same year after the American publishing of The Fellowship, and in America the Two Towers was published at the beginning of the following year. So those four publishings, the two in England and the two in America for The Fellowship of the Ring and The Return of the King, were very close together because he'd written the whole thing. He'd written those, should I say. He'd written those two completely. Tolkien had basically written The Return of the King, I gather, but he'd made this promise in his very first preface when he put out The Fellowship that there would be an index, and indexes came after the end of the story, so the index was going to come at the end of The Return of the King, and he just found that a really heavy slog. In the end, it was published without it. And some kind of index did pop in later, but not the complete index that he originally intended. It seems to me that he wasn't quite so inspired with the third one as he was with the first two. That might just be that I like the first ones better, but I sort of feel like I feel like not quite a weariness came in, but less enthusiasm in the third one. I think there's some point in that book where the story was kind of done before everything was wrapped up, and it just seems to me like he laboured over that last bit, and it was sort of a labour, not a love. But maybe I'll think differently when I get there this time. It's been a while since I've read them, and that's probably the closest I'll come to a spoiler in this whole thing, just that I feel like the earlier ones just seem to flow so nicely. But I thought the same about the movie. So, and I know the movies were sort of made concurrently, so it's probably just that I don't like wars very much. So, there's a lot of talk here about the corrections required in the different editions, spelling mistakes, and the difference in word usage, the subtle differences between America and England that made some of he kind of used words as tags for societies in a way, like a certain group of people will have a certain word they use that's not quite the correct one. That some of that got lost in translation between British and American English. And it's kind of small stuff, but yeah, Tolkien, this was his thing, linguistics, so it wasn't so small to him. Even this edition that I'm using here, I've got another one that I'll get out when I find it in a box, but at the moment, because I've actually got a few different copies of The Lord of the Rings, even this one I've spotted errors. Even in the contents page in this one, it says a shortcut of mushrooms, and I'm pretty sure it's a shortcut to mushrooms. So yeah, there's little things like that pop up in it. So after they talk about the printings, they talk about the second edition, and various little copyright problems, and some of the retcons. There were retcons. They weren't like huge, but what happened to the characters after the story? He clearly changed some of that, because I remember reading some early stuff, and later on some of the post information is a bit different. We don't need to worry about that here. And that's probably the different people who did the different things. How even after it was published, he spent years and years revising the text. And how J.R.R. Tolkien died in 1973. That's pretty much all that's really useful in here. Other little bits about where you can go for more information. So that's all I have for note on the text. Now, forward to the second edition. And the first sentence here is, "This tale grew in the telling until it became a history of the Great War of the Ring, and included many glimpses of the yet more ancient history that preceded it." I really love that sentence. Every time I read this forward to the second edition, and very much that first sentence, because I write stories, and that's what happens when I write too. This tale grew in the telling. And I remember reading that the first time I read it. I was 11 when I read this for the first time, and I was writing stories then too, but I never met anyone else who was writing, and I felt a real kinship with Tolkien at that point. It was the first time I'd ever come across anybody talking about the way they wrote, which I now know is a very common thing. But, when I was 11, I didn't. And I still remember, that's a great sentence, I still remember. So in this he talks about how he wrote The Hobbit, because The Hobbit came out first in 1937. And after he wrote The Hobbit, he'd sort of dived into this mythology and all the lore for his world, and he just spent a long time world building. That makes perfect sense to me. World building is so fun. So before he started the Fellowship, he was world building, and at some point he decided he did want to do a sequel, but people told him that it wouldn't get published, there'd be no interest. People also told him to stick with the children's books. The Hobbit had worked as a children's book, he should write another children's book. Another thing he says is that people had written to him asking for more about hobbits, and he says here, those who had asked for more information about hobbits eventually got it. Then he says how it took him from 1936 to 1949 to write The Lord of the Rings. And I read some of his notes somewhere where he was talking about hobbits and how he'd sort of gotten into the Shire and was forming that society properly, and in the end he had too many hobbits in this book at the start of it when he was writing. His earlier drafts just had a whole lot more hobbit main characters that in the end he's relegated to background scenes. But you can kind of tell when somebody is a well-rounded character, like they fit really well even if they're only in it briefly. It is in this chapter that he addresses the matter of allegory. A lot of people wrote to him suggesting that there was a meaning in it, or asking him what the meaning of the whole thing was, and he says, no, for any inner meaning or message it has in the intention of the author, none. That said, any author inevitably puts details that they know. You can't really prevent elements of your own philosophy of life from appearing in a work. I mean, that that's just part of if you write a scene and you're thinking, no, that wouldn't happen like that. And then he says he mostly wrote the whole thing chronologically. There was a couple of sections that came earlier. The Shadow of the Past, which is chapter 2, that's one of the oldest parts of the tale. We also know that chapter 7 in the House of Tom Bombadil was based on a short story that he had already written. And that's probably all I'm going to say about Foreword to the second edition. The last part of the... Oh, is it? The last part of the prefaces before we get to chapter 1 is the prologue, which is separated into a couple of different sections, but I'll deal with that in a separate video. Thank you for watching.